What's known today as the stance was called the attitude of a boxer in the bare knuckle era. And there's an evolution from the very early period in the 1730s right through until the mid-1800s. So let's have a look at those three main attitudes that were used by boxers. So in the early days, people like James Figg or George Stevenson are shown in a very upright attitude. Either like this, or Figg would stand like this. And this upright attitude was used by boxers who would just basically stand there and exchange blows with each other. They wouldn't move or shift very much. So this very upright attitude was very conducive to throwing a blow, blocking it, and then throwing a blow straight back at your opponent. So this upright attitude, you can see, was used by the early boxers. Now, that started to develop as boxers started to move into a more dynamic way of moving. People like Tom Johnson, who had a very exaggerated version of the next attitude, and Daniel Mendoza, whose attitude was very classic. They'd be very low, with their hands out like this. They'd kind of have their buttocks sticking outwards, body pushed forwards, hands out in front. Now, the benefit of this attitude is that you can move in very quickly, dynamically, retreat and advance, but also is very conducive to grappling, which was very much part of that bare knuckle era. Nice and low, you can thrust in with punches, or you can come in to throw your opponent. And so this was the kind of middle era, which is known as the old school, is this attitude. Now, as boxing developed more into a shifting, punching game, you'd start to see a different attitude where the boxer would cover their mark here with their rear hand, and they'd have their lead hand out, and they'd lean backwards to avoid punches to the head. Like this. And you can see people like Henry Pierce, who had an extremely leaning back attitude, or just this kind of standard attitude like this. And this is the one that really stayed with boxing for the longest time. So let's just try and throw a few punches on the bag from these different attitudes, and you can see how they work. So, earliest attitude, very upright. Like this. Now, let's go to either the Tom Johnson, which is really extended, or the Daniel Mendoza, which is not quite as extended. And this is the attitude I tend to favour. Now let's look at what was called the New School, which is really kind of started in the early 1800s. So each of those three attitudes have their different advantages and disadvantages. The early one, like this, leaves you quite grounded in your feet. So really it is a matter of punching and taking a punch back, advancing and retreating kind of minimally. The next one here allows for quite a lot of dynamic footwork, moving forwards and backwards, and it's a pretty useful one for that style of bare knuckle. The New School, like this, is very good for avoiding headshots, and it still blocks this mark here. But even though you can come in with some quite powerful punches, it stops you being able to grapple quite so easily. So you can't, from here you have to do a lot more manoeuvring to get into grappling positions. Old style, first style, middle style, new style. The other good thing about the newer style, like this, which was called the New School in the 1800s, you can parry shots very easily with this front hand. You can block and parry, and you stay protected. This style here, you can block and parry, but you haven't got quite as much range in your blocks and parries, but you can maneuver quite easily, and you're you're in a really good position to grapple with your opponent, potentially going in for a cross buttock or a lock, which are different kinds of throws. Old school, new school.